I'm Rebecca Lavoie. Welcome to the Undisclosed Addendum. Today we're talking about episode 4 of the new season of Undisclosed. It's about Jeff Titus, who was convicted of the 1990 murders of Doug Estes and Jim Bennett 12 years after the double homicide in 2002. Titus is currently incarcerated in Michigan and has always maintained his innocence. If you haven't listened to episode 4 of this series, we are going to be talking about it. So pause this podcast, go back and listen, and then come back and listen to this conversation. We will still be here. Joining me today is Susan Simpson, one of the co-hosts of Undisclosed and the lead investigator on this series for the podcast. Hey, Susan.
Hey, Rebecca.
Also back with us is Jacinda Davis. She's an Emmy Award-winning producer and the executive producer at Red Marble Media, who is producing the Killer in Question show for Investigation Discovery. Hey there. How you doing, Jacinda?
Hey, Rebecca. I'm good. Thanks.
And we're coming to you live from a cornfield somewhere. Some kind of field. No promises
literally?
on the kind of...
Are you in your car right now?
We are sitting in the car in the middle of a cornfield.
Some kind of field.
I feel like I'm in the middle of an Undisclosed episode. This is like an immersive
You kind of are. This is between interviews, so...
Finally with us is Tania Castellanos. She's an Emmy Award-winning documentary producer, currently working in true crime. She's based in New Orleans, but currently travels all over the country, producing several programs for Red Marble Media, including Shattered, Evil Lives Here, and Killer in Question. Hey, Tania.
Hello.
Now, we found out before we started taping that we have met before, right?
Yes, we have. I worked on a series called Deadly Sins, and
Yes.
I interviewed you and your spouse, Kevin, and you guys were delightful. And and I've been following you on Facebook and social media ever since, and really delighted to see all of the kind of interesting cases you're following up there in New Hampshire.
Yeah, we have a lot going on here. And of course, I also work with the Undisclosed team. And so, my interest in true crime takes me everywhere, including to the middle of a cornfield in Michigan, apparently. First, I do want to talk about this week's episode of Undisclosed. There is some supposition because of a wallet situation and content scattered everywhere around at the scene of the shooting that this crime may have been a robbery. Susan, can you remind us of those details and then just talk about, was anything taken and could it have been a robbery?
Yeah, this is sort of one of the few basic facts from the crime scene that we have that seems to have immediate significance. And then that's the fact that the wallet from Jim Bennett had been removed, we presume, from like a pants pocket. And the contents were thrown about, primarily business cards, some like a bank card. And the wallet itself was tossed somewhere even farther away. The pictures are a little hard to decipher, but there was no cash found. And of course, you see that in any scene, the first thought's going to be, well, was this a robbery? And it's not a question they have an answer to by the time of trial. It's a open question in that sense, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Jim Bennett had money on him that day. His girlfriend says, yeah, he had like at least 75, I think a bit more. He just cashed a check from work on the Friday. He had the money, hadn't deposited it, so based on the fairly good evidence, there was money there, and the fact that the money is no longer there when the police arrived on the scene, could this be a robbery?
But what about Doug Estes? Was his wallet intact?
Doug's wallet was still in his back pocket, but Doug was wearing like bib overalls or some sort of Carhartt hunting. Yep. So it would have been hard for someone to... It would have been hard maybe for him to get his wallet out or for someone to have him get the wallet out. But yes, his wallet was intact in his pocket when his body was found.
And also they did check for like signs of blood on the wallet or on the pocket. They found none. They did find some evidence of blood staining around the pocket where presumably the wallet had been, suggesting someone had transferred blood there.
Now, Tania, you've covered a lot of true crime cases, so I'm going to ask you a question because this is what I thought of when I heard this potential robbery theory. Would somebody who came upon someone in the woods, shot and killed them for the contents of their wallet, not just take the whole wallet rather than riffle through it and throw everything all over the forest floor? What do you think, Tanya?
As someone who has been robbed at gunpoint, I can tell you they're not going to stand around and rifle through things. They're going to grab the value. They're just going to grab what they think might be useful and run off and go look at it somewhere else. At least that's been my personal experience. And I think that happens a lot. You find the wallet, I don't know, like a mile away or, 50 feet away or somewhere where they can take cover and start rifling through things.
Right. Unless, of course, the potential robber said, give me your money, not give me your wallet. And then the person with the wallet opened the wallet and in the process of pulling out the money, stuff went flying. But it sounds, Susan, like there was a lot of stuff all over, right? Not just like a one business card and a driver's license.
This is one thing there's a lot of things I wish they'd done better documenting. This is one thing that would be really helpful to have a thorough documentation of what happened, where stuff was. It appears as if the wallet was mostly empty, but we don't really know. There's a photo that could be of the wallet on the forest floor, but we don't really know. There's definitely business cards that are scattered around visible, but only a few of them are readable, and we can tell what they're for or what they were. And to some of the detectives and some of the police officers there, they think it looks like a staged robbery. That someone's trying to, and I don't know how I feel about, I don't know how someone would naturally rifle through a wallet and toss stuff around. I don't know if this looks like it's an excess of that. They definitely did cover a bit of ground. I think the better argument's not in how the contents themselves were thrown about, but the fact they were thrown about right there at the scene.
Right. No, I agree. And I was thinking that too, is that if you think about it, if you wanted a scene to look like a robbery, taking a wallet away wouldn't make it look like that. It would just look like there was no wallet there. And that may not be a thing that investigators would even think to look for, because the absence of something doesn't mean anything in the moment, right?
Yeah, these guys might not have thought of that.
Yeah, so that to me, I mean, I'm not saying for sure that it was a staged robbery, but to me, it doesn't point to robbery as the motive, but something else, like maybe potentially a staged robbery. I'm curious, Jacinda, what do you think? Do you have a gut feeling about this?
I don't have a gut feeling about this one. Another theory is that someone went through his wallet, one, because it was easy to get to see who they had just killed, to see if there was identification. And in some ways that makes sense to me. Why everything is thrown about is still, I don't have a good theory about that.
Yeah. Can you guys talk a little bit about the ballistics evidence? Because there were two different kinds of projectiles, I'll just say, because one of them was shot and one of them was a bullet, right? So, Jacinda, can you just describe that ballistics evidence for us and what it could mean? I know that there were two theories kind of thrown out in the podcast episode.
Sure. So the two victims were not killed by the same kind of ammunition. One was a slug and one was a buckshot. Double-aught buckshot, or double-aught slug.
No, double-aught buckshot. 12 pellets apparently, but yeah. And then the slug was just, as far as we know, just a regular slug.
Right. So you could think, okay, that means there's two different guns involved, two shooters involved. But what we've learned is that hunters often load their rifles with slug buckshot. It's a method, so if you miss the deer on your first shot with the slug, you're gonna get it with the second shot with the buckshot, because the little pellets spread out and they hit more of the deer. But it's not good for the meat. Yeah. It destroys more of the meat, so you don't really want to use the buckshot. So it could be one gun, it could be two guns.
It's also worth noting that everyone we've talked to, and most hunters are very familiar with this style of loading a gun. What was the guy we talked to today? What do you call it?
Oh yeah, ball buck
style. But they know of it, but they also pretty much universally describe it as like an old school style of doing it, or the way my granddad taught me how to do it. So it's fallen out of favor. Even by 1990, it was no longer the common way of doing it. It still happened, but it wasn't the standard way of doing it at the time. We've also heard, so predominantly people seem to think the way of doing it, the style properly, quote unquote, is to do the slug round first, so the large single ballistics projectile, followed by the buckshot round, followed by slug, buckshot, slug, which would mean the first shot you fired would be a slug round. But there's like a decent minority of people who say the reverse, that they were taught to do the buckshot round first, then the slug. Yep. So it seems like the detectives in this case really thought that the only way of doing it, this way of mixing it up was to have the slug first. So from that, they seem to have concluded that Doug Estes was shot first. But that to me has never been a very convincing or like just decisive answer, because one, some people will tell you, no, I do a buckshot first and then the slug, for whatever logic they're employing.
I have the logic behind that, because I asked somebody I know who hunts, and he said that the buckshot could have been first, because what that does is it allows you to have the spray first, and then if you don't kill the animal, you have the shot so that you can finish it like cleanly. So that was what the person who hunted told me, but he had heard of it. He had been taught by his father to do it the other way, slug, because that's more of like a in his mind, like a sporting way of hunting, because the slug is more fair. I mean, it's like you have the one shot. It's not,
buckshot's
buckshot.
The Hail Mary. You do the slug.
It's considered by some hunters to be not purist, and this is a way to sort of try to do both,
The other thing we don't know, I mean, the assumption is that it was the first shot fired out of the gun. Someone, they could have already shot the slug.
And not reloaded.
And so the next shot would have been the buckshot. Like, there's just no way to know for sure which whether Doug or Jim was shot first.
So I'm going to go back to Tania because, again, she's my sounding board for my theories on this case. Tania, what occurs to me is that somebody who intended to commit a murder with their hunting rifle would not load their gun this way. They would do slug, 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 slug. And that this was somebody, if it was one gun, somebody who intended to hunt, not necessarily kill, especially two people. What do you think?
This is all coming at me right now, very new. And I'm trying to just follow slug, shot. But what I'm imagining is that they would have to reload a different type of ammunition, correct? Like they would have to, it would be reloaded with a slug than a shot. And it just sounds so very complicated if you're out to commit a murder.
I was told by a couple officers, I talked to them about this, and they said, well, that's how I load my service shotgun.
Really?
Slug, buck, slug, buck, slug. So it's old school hunting style or modern police shotgun style.
Interesting. Huh. I wonder if that's also so if you miss, you can,
Yeah, it seems to be the same logic for the deer. The first one's hopefully works. If you fail with it, well, the second one will at least get some part of them.
Yeah. So is there evidence for a two-shooter theory besides this ballistics?
The two-shooter theory is something that at one of the appellate stages, Titus's then defense counsel was using, and there's some evidence to support it. I don't personally find the slug-buck thing to be evidence one way or the other. It did, and I was really kind of gratified when I talked to Detective Rich Madison, and to hear that someone else had seen what seemed to me kind of obvious, not the same, is that the way the bodies were positioned, if big if there, that's how they had been all along. I don't think one person could have done this crime, because it's not in a position, it'd be like being from the outside shooting in to one person on the inside shooting out, if that makes sense. So it's hard to see how in the space of racking the shotgun, the person could have changed position while the surviving person is still able to move and get away.
Right.
But there is some movement of the bodies after death. We know that the bodies were rolled over, and that could have changed that logic there.
Jacinda, do you have a feeling about this? The one shooter versus two shooter theory?
I'm leaning towards a one shooter theory. It just seems, I don't know. I go back and forth with everything on this case. I go back and forth. In some ways it makes sense that there's two people who overpowered two people. Like, how can one person overpower two people who are both armed? We've all seen that in the movie where one person draws their gun and then someone draws their gun on them, and you have this kind of chain reaction of everyone pointing a gun at each other, and there's only one man standing at the end. So can one person take down two armed hunters? Yes, maybe, probably that's what happened. Does it make sense that there are two shooters there? Yes. But, since you asked me right now at this moment, I would say it's one shooter.
Yeah, same.
Okay. Let's talk about the search for that gun, because this is a big point in the episode because Jeff Titus found the gun, so he says, and we'll talk about that convoluted, complicated story in a minute, but I just want to talk about what was done to actually look for this gun. We heard a couple of different potential accounts of this because the report names sort of one distance away from the scene that was searched, but then an investigator kind of said a different thing. Can you just talk, Susan, about whether or not you think this search for this gun was adequate given the circumstances?
There was a search done. I think that night, if the gun had not been right near the bodies, there was just no... Maybe they would have accidentally found it, but I just don't think that you can assume they would have. The lights were very bright. By all accounts, they were... In fact, yesterday I heard from someone who had been living on the other side of the game area, and they recall the sky having that strange like haze, which you don't see in the country a lot from, bright city lights. So the lights were bright, but still, it's a forest. It's a smallish area, but like finding a shotgun there, that's going to be difficult. So the real search should have been done next morning, and it was. The problem is that they had 2 deputies doing it, and it's for a grid search, it's a real big area for 2 people to cover for a thorough search. And in fact, they were supposed to have more. We don't know. So what the people who were there remember is that there had been like a plan to leave the 2 there overnight to watch it, keep watching the scene. And in the morning, more would come out and do a much more detailed search. Apparently, overnight, a man had wandered away from like a nursing home. So all the other deputies were involved looking for him somewhere north in the county. And the 2 deputies who were there overnight were the only ones left to do this search of this entire area by themselves. Mm-hmm. To me, and this is reading between the lines of their report, I don't get the sense that they really thought they'd have a chance in hell of finding that shotgun, because they seem to think that, they keep mentioning, there's a swamp right here immediately to the south. We can't get in that swamp. There's a big swamp on the way out towards the parking area to the left. We can't get in that swamp. You could hide a gun there. You get the sense in their heads are like, okay, well, we're doing our search. We're going to search the area we need to, but also that gun's probably in the swamp or gone miles away. And then in the report, they write 50 to 60 feet is the search radius. So like, I guess, 100 feet diameter, but still 50 to 60 feet from the bodies is the limit where they searched. And that would never have found this shotgun.
Why do you think they thought there might be a gun to find? That's my question, because I don't think of killers shooting people in the woods as necessarily tossing the gun. I think of them taking the gun with them, just away from the scene, period. Maybe it's their gun and they don't want to get rid of it, or maybe they, I'm just curious, Jacinda, why do you think that, they thought there was a gun to find?
Well, they knew that Doug Estes' gun was missing from the scene.
Okay. Yep.
So I guess the question was, did whoever did this take the gun with them? Did Doug get disarmed somewhere and walked into the position where he was shot? Did someone, grab the gun and drop it on their way out? Like, there was enough reason to think the gun could still be there. But like you said, most people probably thought it had been thrown in the swamp or had been taken.
So now I'm wondering, What do you think, if you had a shotgun, you're trying to throw it, how far could you possibly get on it?
Well, we need a shotgun.
We
need a shotgun and to test it out.
I'm also curious about, so what was Doug Estes' gun the murder weapon?
Okay, so worth noting, the gun that was found, like, I'm willing to call it Doug Estes' shotgun.
But we don't know for sure that it was his gun?
I'm willing to go along with everyone's assumption that it is, but I have a lot of problems that we're assuming this, because it had a serial number and they could have run the serial number and they never did, that we can find. So everyone's like, okay, this gun is Doug. We know that Doug's gun before it's found is described as a Mossberg and a short barrel, which it kind of wasn't, but it could possibly be a short barrel. But I will call it Doug Estes' shotgun for the sake of going along, and it probably was. It still bothers me that no one ever tested the serial number.
Yeah, and was there any attempt? I mean, I know that ballistics evidence is BS when it comes to like matching guns with bullets, but was there any attempt to do that with the gun that was found?
It's for shotguns. It's not even BS. It's like kind of impossible unless you have a firing pin mark to measure against. There's no evidence whatsoever that the shotgun, that the Mossberg that Titus found is the one that was used to kill the victims. Circumstantially, I find it extremely unlikely that it was, because in 1990 and later on, they asked, like, what did Doug hunt with? And his stepson said, we loaded with slugs. I don't remember him shooting with slug buck. So we can't rule it out, but if he'd been hunting the slug buck style, I think Bobby would have known. And Bobby felt confident they were hunting with slugs.
Is it possible that somebody who was in the proximity of the bodies just took the gun, took Estes' gun because they wanted a gun?
That's very likely.
Something you have to wonder. Like, who took the gun? Like, was it the killer? Was the gun dropped before the killings happened?
Was that part of the robbery? Were they like, okay, I can't get your wallet, but hand me your gun instead?
Yeah, and so the gun that Bennett had was an old, apparently like almost antique muzzleloader from what we've heard described. So it probably wouldn't have been something that caught, someone's eye. And the Mossberg was, it's not like the nicest, high-end, like fanciest model. It's a good, solid model. Apparently it's a newish gun too. So it would be something that if you were doing a robbery for a few bucks in someone's wallet, you might want. I should also mention there's also been some suggestion, unverified, that Bennett may have actually had quite a bit of cash on him that day. At this point I'd call it unverified, but there were reports that he'd had hundreds of dollars on him with some, I'm not sure to call it evidence, but some record to support that, which, would increase the possibility of someone being interested in a robbery, especially if they could have known that Bennett might have had this cash on him that day.
Right. And do we have any sense of who would have known that he had that money besides you said his wife knew that, right?
Yeah, there may have been additional cash he had on him that others possibly could have known about. We might get into that later. It's still unconfirmed at this point, but it is theoretically possible someone could have seen Bennett and had a reason to guess he would have had more cash on him. Theoretically.
All right.
The other thing is someone could have shot them with their own gun and grabbed Doug's gun and started to leave, and then it crossed their mind like, oh, walking out with carrying two guns, someone, you're more likely to notice that than someone. We saw hunters walking out.
Yeah, that was Ballett's reasoning. It's a good point. Like, okay, anyone walking out of the forest with a shotgun's gonna look totally normal. Someone walking out with two shotguns, that's gonna look a little weird.
Right. Really interesting. So let's talk about Jeff Titus finding the gun that he found. We can't necessarily say for sure it was Estes' gun, and we certainly can't say whether it was the murder weapon. Can you go over the timeline of the events around his finding the gun?
Sure. So the murders happened on a Saturday, November 17th. 2 days later, on Monday, Jeff goes out to check his traps because he ran a trap line around his property, and he stumbled upon on Monday he stumbled upon the gun.
He was also, so he had not gone, he says he'd not gone to the crime scene yet, and that Monday morning he was going to go out and try and see where this had taken place behind his house, behind his fields, and he never got there because he found the gun and went back to call it. Although it's worth noting that same day when the cops came by to pick the gun up, they did take Titus to the actual crime scene, like where the shooting took place, and took photos of him there, like at the actual crime scene, in addition to where the gun was found.
So I just want to get into something that happened in the episode that struck me because I don't hear it very often in cases that you guys are investigating for the podcast, and that is doubt around the veracity of your potentially wrongfully convicted subject's story. And now he has this story about finding the gun, but there is some doubt about the story. And Susan, you talk in the episode very frankly about, for a long time, I don't know how you feel today, but you really don't believe, or part of you does not believe the story he is telling you about having found this gun that he's been telling to people for years.
Yeah. So in every case we cover, like you have to, for any innocence case you're doing, or should be for any case, you have to approach with like, we'll see where this goes. Even the weird stuff, you're like, let's see where this goes. So at first I wouldn't say I usually have doubt about a story. I'm just like, okay, I don't know. We'll find out where this goes. And I was going to say often, but I say always there's stuff you're questioning about a defendant's story. Just because defendants themselves often misremember things or have things wrong. And you can also have more access to them. It's often for some cases. So it's always like, okay, well, are you you want to check back with them? This is probably the first time where I have like actively decided, and I usually try and reserve judgment on everything until the last possible moment. But at a certain point in a case, you do have to start deciding what you believe is true and what is not true, and what facts you think you're going to work from going forward. And there was a point in this case where I was 100% that Jeff Titus was lying, full on. And I thought that I was assessing the evidence in the only way that made sense. And later on, I realized that maybe I had been viewing things through the wrong lens.
I have a feeling we're going to hear about that in an upcoming episode, right? So this is a situation where people who knew Jeff Titus made statements about things he said at work specifically. Jacinda, can you just give us a quick summary of that and talk about how it affected his case?
Sure. So a lot of people report that Jeff talked a lot about the crime and specifically about finding the gun, and would make comments about how he was able to find it when the cops couldn't. You know, he would kind of make himself look like the hero for finding the gun. And some people testified that he told them he took the gun home and cleaned it. Jeff has always said that he did not touch the gun. He did not take it home. He found it and he went back up to his house and he called the police. He also called the newspaper. So why he's telling people he touched the gun, took it home, he says he didn't tell anyone that it's a big game of telephone. They misunderstood what he was saying. So it's sort of a question of who do you believe?
So do you think this is a situation where he created a legend around a thing that happened in his life that was like an interesting story that he told about himself? Like, I always think about those Jeopardy contestants, R.I.P. Alex Trebek,
Jeopardy story.
Who, no, but the one when they always ask them tell us this interesting fact about yourself. So I hear you can play the piano with your toes or whatever. Like, everybody has at least one of those, right? A thing they were involved in or a story they tell that they can sort of, that is like their personal legend. Is it possible that his personal legend just kind of grew a little bit and that's how he just talked about it? What do you guys think?
I think that's part of it, but I think there's also the fact that the news article has to be taken into account, because you don't just have to have Jeff telling you to know about it. Like, the newspaper had it with his picture there. So even if Jeff himself didn't bring it up, you might already know from reading about it, and people are more likely to bring it up to him in conversation. So it was a thing that was talked about even more because of it. But yeah, Jeff definitely was thinking like, hey, I found the shotgun, so wonder what the cops are doing out there.
The other thing, people draw conclusions from what they hear and read in the paper. So we know the gun was missing. We know 2 days later, Jeff finds the gun. And at some point, and Susan, you might know this better than me, at some point they must report that there's no fingerprints on the gun.
They do, yeah.
So the one conclusion you could draw is, oh, Jeff found it. He must have wiped it clean.
Yeah. Although I've also heard from, I can't count how many witnesses now, who are like, I asked them about the case. They're like, yeah, I heard that the landowner nearby, he found the gun 10 or 12 years later. And that's why they convicted him. I'm like, well, not quite. Is that actually, would that make him more guilty or less guilty? I don't even know.
He still had the gun 10 years later.
No, if he found it in the woods 10 or 12 years later.
That would be a little...
Yeah. It was in the swamp, though. I could see it.
The other thing is, what I think is important, even if Jeff took the gun home, it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't make him a murderer. It makes it more interesting that he took it home and possibly cleaned it, but it still doesn't make him, it still doesn't really link him to the murders in any concrete way, at least not in my mind.
As Stan Driscoll would say, it makes him an unwise man.
It makes him an unwise man.
If that happened. But yeah, that's the other thing too. Like, there's we spent a lot of time on this question, and then sometimes we look back, we're like, wait, so okay, end of the day, even if he did take it home and clean it, is that really, even if we did prove he did that, it matters a lot, I'd care about it, but are we actually proving anything significant in terms of who killed these people?
Right. It also strikes me that, I don't want to say why would he lie about that, because it obviously doesn't look great if he swiped the gun and then took it home and cleaned it. But maybe he found it, took it home and cleaned it, didn't realize. Or maybe he found it, realized later it may be connected to this crime, so then he cleaned it and threw it in the woods and then found it, quote, found it. Who knows? But there's a lot of reasons why, at this point, so many years later, he probably would have just confessed to that or copped to it, because it is something that is bad. And it's like, I don't know, it struck me that he doesn't seem to have the guile to construct this three-dimensional chess kind of story. I mean, that's just my impression.
What did you tell me Jacinda one time? It was he's not a strategic thinker.
Yeah.
No, that's not the way of putting it. It's he's not...
He probably isn't great at chess.
Yeah, that's what you told me, actually. He's probably not great. Yeah, she's like, I don't think Titus would be great at chess. And he's not. I can say without a doubt, he is not saying the things that would be best for him. If he was trying to do a story, that's not the story you're getting from him. It's not what would be great for his version of events and would be the easiest thing. That is not what you get from Jeff Titus.
Right. Right. All right. So one last question before we move on. He did pass a polygraph. Now, you mentioned in the episode, of course, that polygraph test's not admissible, that it's kind of a junk science. However, polygraph tests are a useful investigative tool in some ways. So, for instance, somebody's willingness to take one or lack of willingness can tell the cops something. Somebody's, general affect around polygraphs can tell cops something. But can you just talk a little bit about what his passing the polygraph test means to you? I know it didn't get him out of prison, but what does it mean to you? I'm just curious to know, fitting in the context of this case. What do you think, Susan?
I do want to stress that, although we talked about it in the episode, like the polygraph passing itself, I do not believe should be considered. It doesn't matter. What matters and why we talked about it on the show is that this is Jeff's story from not day one, but like day, seven, 8?
Yeah. From
very early on, this is his story, and he's not on the record, not under oath, but effectively under oath, and many people treat it like that. Like, if you believe in polygraphs, and he did, you would think, this is a story I have to tell, has to be true. And that's a story he's still telling 30 years later.
Do we know what else they asked him about in the polygraph?
I think it was just that.
It was just those questions. But another important component of the polygraph is the lead up to the questions, where they asked Jeff to go over the story again. Tell me what happened. Tell me, where you were. Tell me how you found the gun. And all of that stuff is sort of the lead up. And how he answers those questions in many ways is just as important as the results of the polygraph. And they asked a lot about the gun and whether or not he touched it or he moved it or anything like that. He has always stuck with his story that he did not touch it.
And I also want to just say, passing a polygraph when you're lying does not make you a sociopath.
Right. No, it doesn't. It just... No, that's a total, and it's so funny because there's all these myths around polygraphs that are so funny. One of the ways allegedly to fool them is to tighten your sphincter like you're holding in a poo. Apparently that's supposed to help you pass a polygraph. There's all these weird, but it really is. I mean, Susan, I'm not wrong that really the main use of it, and this is also not just used in criminal cases, but for hiring, for different areas in which polygraphs are used. It's about a subject sort of willingness or lack of willingness. That's a huge part of what it is, right?
It's a way of interrogating that gets you there. Okay, it's not under oath, but a way of saying give us your final answer here, and sort of formality and rigmarole. That's okay, last chance, final answer. Let's hear it, and we'll know if you're lying. No, they won't.
Right.
But it's their chance to get on the record as their final answer.
Right. And then they can also use the polygraph results to direct the direction an interview goes in too. Because they can say, it looks like you weren't truthful here, if they already suspect the person wasn't truthful.
I mean, they can do that, whether that's useful, I don't know.
Yeah, regular people don't know how to look at that thing and see what it means. You know what I mean?
It's like what's the Wire episode where they had the fax machine?
Yes, exactly.
I actually think I saw on Amazon that there's a new polygraph, an at-home polygraph with you can plug it in your USB.
Well, I am getting that.
Perfect.
And we're going to try it out.
I forget where I saw that. Someone sent it to me, and I was like, uh-oh.
Now I must know.
Stocking stuffer idea for Susan Simpson.
I could use it on my teenagers.
There you go.
Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the case in this week's episode of Killer in Question. This is the Thomas Lee Cisco case, a case I will admit I know nothing about. Tania, can you give me a rundown on this case?
Well, I think what's interesting about this case is that on the surface, it seems pretty unassuming. It's a presumed robbery gone awry at a convenience store in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in 1997. And unfortunately, the 3 people who were inside the convenience store, 2 employees and a friend of the employee, are found shot dead in a drink cooler in the back of the store the following morning when the next set of employees comes to open up the store. And you just think, oh, this is just awful. Some depraved person has come and killed these people and left the bodies, took all the money and ran, which... It was a 4th of July weekend. The cash registers were full. This is 1997. So there was, really just about maybe 10 grand in cash in the register that weekend. But when you start digging into it, it gets really strange. There's too many odd coincidences, lots of murky rumors, lots of very strange allegations. And it's an interesting case.
Jacinda, tell me about some of the murkiness around this case. Why is this a killer in question episode?
It's a killer in question episode because there are a lot of questions about who the actual killer is, and those killers. And those questions still remain today.
I think that from talking to you, focusing kind of like, okay, so we have one guy who's saying that he was there and did this, and that we know two people, or we think we know two people did the robbery. So who's number two? That's the killer in question.
And I'd like to interrupt because I think what's really interesting about this case is that it had gone cold for quite some time. And they got a huge break in the case due to America's Most Wanted. And it led to two different suspects. It led to both Thomas Cisco as a potential suspect, and it also led to Richard McElvin, who was at the time, he was the son of the sheriff in Lake Charles at the time. So, I mean, of course, you have people in the town saying the sheriff's son is involved. He matches the composite sketch. And so it just created total chaos.
How did this case get on your radar, Jacinda?
Actually, this is a case that Tania found, and it's an interesting story. Tania, go ahead. And I think, if I remember right, you had actually called about a different case.
Yeah, I was researching a different case that had taken place in Lake Charles, and I reached out to Rick Bryant, who was a former prosecutor there in Calcasieu Parish. And he was telling, I was trying to get the information about this other case, and it just wasn't an interesting case to me. It really wasn't. And I said, well, Rick, what is a case that you remember? And he's like, oh my God, have I got a case for you? And then he went and proceeded to tell me as much as he could remember off the cuff about this case. It had been over 20 years that he'd worked on it. But he said, this is the craziest goddamn case I've ever worked on. And I was like, I am very intrigued. And it just so happened that I had spoken to the homicide detective on that case for, prior research. So I reached out to him and, I got the ball rolling. But it wasn't easy to get started because it's very hard to get access to public records in Calcasieu Parish. It was a huge roadblock for us. It took a lot of time. But and honestly, I don't think I've seen everything to this day. There's still more out there that I can get my hands on.
We also had some natural disasters. Every time we thought we were going to get close to getting the records, a hurricane went through Lake Charles, it seems like.
Wow.
It's a conspiracy.
So were you guys able to talk to Cisco for the show?
It's interesting that you should ask because Angola does allow prisoners to talk to the media. And I sent a letter to him in Angola prison here in Louisiana, and he declined my interview.
Really?
Which, as far as I can tell, is the only time in his life he's declined to talk about this case.
I thought that was really curious. I think it's worth trying again.
Yeah.
So you can get the 26th news story from him?
Yeah.
Maybe it's interesting to look up the most recent one. Maybe it was a terrible experience that portrayed him in a really bad light, potentially.
He's never spoken to the media except for that one time when he was awaiting trial. He spoke to the local Lake Charles Parish news on the phone from jail.
I'm fascinated that they allow prisoners to talk to the media without any the media doesn't. You don't have to get on his visitor list or anything. They have it like lawyer visits that you can just be a member of the media and interview someone in Angola. That's fascinating.
You have to go through their media department. They have to know who you are. I couldn't just ask to be put on his call list without them notifying. I have to notify Angola and say, I'm with the media. I'd like to talk to Thomas Cisco. So, it makes me wonder, did he truly decline or did the prison prevent me from talking to him? That does remain, that I've thought about that.
Yeah. And from my point of view, I know that I'm not on the same page as Jacinda and Tania here, but looking at this case, I'm like, why does everyone think they've got one of the right guys looking for number two? I'm questioning number one here when he's never been able to give the same story twice. He's named 100 different co-defendants, all of whom were never pursued or couldn't be pursued. And to me, the fact you've got one guy confessing to this crime doesn't actually tell you more about the case. It doesn't actually give you any answers about what happened here. It felt like, okay, so we already knew someone came in there, robbed the store, shot 3 people. And that's what Cisco's confession gives you. It doesn't add anything more to the whole story. And just the fact that
I want to hear more about these confessions. I want to hear more about the different stories he told. Who did he tell them to? Over what period of time?
Everyone
what
but the
kinds of
media.
things did he say?
Well, you know this, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he started out by saying he was there. Then he said he did it. He named who was with him. Then he said he did it all by himself. At one point he said that Richard, the sheriff's son, paid him to do it. Tania, was it $20,000, 10 up front and 10 when it was done? He just had a lot of different stories, and everyone, and this was over months, that he would call Lucky, the detective, and say, this time I'm going to tell you the truth. This time, I'm really sorry I lied to you before, but this time I'm going to tell you the truth.
Wait, he would initiate those conversations? Are you sure?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's the opposite. I mean, he initially was sort of sounded like a little Jay Wilds vibe to me. It still does.
A little bit, but guy,
like the idea that he's initiating these conversations, like, why would he do that?
Look, this guy out JJ.
Every time you go in the interrogation room, you get a pack of cigarettes and a soda. It's like not a bad way to spend a day to get out of.
Yeah.
And what was odd is that Lucky Delouche, the detective, had known Cisco for quite some time because Cisco had gone through their juvenile system. And Lucky was actually kind of stunned that Cisco was the one who he confessed to these murders. And, Delouche thinks he did them. But he was like, Cisco never struck me as like a violent guy. He didn't seem like the kind of guy who would do this.
And one of the victims was his friend. Like, he had there's no sign of any problems with her that I'm aware of. Are there?
Well, this is the thing that I find really strange. Cisco and Stacy had a sexual relationship of some kind. I don't know if it was a one-night stand or just like a very brief fling. It ended. I don't know how it ended. I don't know if it ended badly, if they were just friends. I kept seeing different versions of their relationship and people's statements, and it was hard to nail down.
But that's also why he was a suspect, because he knew one of the victims. Like, that's kind of the link that the caller who called in has. Like, this guy knows one of the victims.
And he knew one of the victims. He had been to the store before, and they always thought it was someone who had some knowledge of the store because they knew where to cut the telephone wires, they knew to take the VHS tape, they knew there was a safe in the back. Like, there was enough, they always thought it was someone who had been to the store, knew someone who worked in the store, had something to do.
Well, that's the thing. To explain how Cisco did it, you have to imply basically that Stacy told him how to do it.
Right. Like, why would someone who's only been in the store a couple times know where the security tapes are? How would they know where to cut the phone lines? Like, Cisco's knowledge of the place seems really strange. I've always been, I still have a lot of unresolved questions about, there was a kid who worked at that store. And I say kid only because he was like 17 or 18. He worked at the store and he quit 2 days before the crime. And he was suspected of stealing drugs out of the convenience store. And I mean, I know here comes the polygraph thing again, but when the detectives learned of this, they questioned him. His alibi was a little soft. They gave him 2 polygraphs and he failed. So was he the one supplying Cisco with information about the convenience store, like where everything was located?
But Cisco didn't know him, did he?
It doesn't seem like it. And Cisco was like maybe 8 or 9 years older than him.
Wow. And I hear there was a witness as well?
Sort of.
Sort of. There was not a witness to the murder.
Okay.
There was a woman who came into the convenience store right around closing time when 2 men happened to walk in. Were in the store at the same time she was, and one of them bumped into her. And that's why she remembers them so well. She said she got a really bad vibe off of them.
But she didn't remember them that well until
she was hypnotized.
Yeah, which is even more bullshit than polygraphs.
Yeah, that's not good. The hypnosis witness is always the one that you don't want to have, for sure.
And she's the only one.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, Tania, you have an opinion about this case, like whether or not Cisco is culpable, like who may be culpable? Like, are you willing to share it with me?
Yes. I mean, for the longest time, I had always felt pretty strongly that Cisco was involved based on yes, he gave multiple confessions. Yes, he's told a ton of lies. But there are 2 things for me that were really, that I I firmly believe he knew where the victims' bodies were located in those coolers. He described the youngest victim, when he said after he shot her, or after she was shot, that she didn't really fall down. She just kind of slumped over. And that's exactly how her body was found in the cooler.
Guess what? Photos show that too, though.
That information is something only a killer would know.
Or the cop with the photos.
But we don't know if we don't know if Cisco saw that information.
He's been interviewed 5 million times. The cop showed him photos.
So Susan's seen this before.
I've seen this 100 million times. Look, I don't know if Cisco's innocent. I've not gotten the case, look at the granular details of it. But the fact that Cisco has 20 million stories and we have no idea which one's possibly true, we're just assuming the part that has him there is true. I'm really uncomfortable with any kind of case based on that.
But then why would Cisco write this
because something's wrong with the dude. Either whether he's guilty or not, something is going wrong with his brain. I feel we can agree on that part.
But he wrote this very heartfelt, he was sobbing, writing this apology to Stacey Reeves, one of the victims, in a taped interview. He wrote this letter. He wanted to read it on camera, and it just seemed so strange that he would say something like that to apologize to his friend. He didn't mean for it to happen. So to me, that is almost like treading into admission territory as well.
He's admitted it a million times. For me, a confession needs to give more details of the it needs to have something. It needs to add to the story, and Cisco just doesn't seem to do it. It's just he's like, I did it. I fill in this role that you knew someone filled, and then I'm going to lead you on a million wild goose chases who the other person was. Which we should mention the sheriff's son part. From what I've seen, it seems like that the sheriff's son has been kind of wrongfully mixed up in this case.
Yeah.
For a long time.
And there doesn't seem to be any real evidence to suggest he was involved in this case at all. But he has certainly paid the price for being named and for, a lot of people talking about him and pointing the finger at him.
He just looked a lot like the composite sketch to a lot of people. But then I showed his photo and the composite sketch side by side to a lot of people in our office who've never seen Richard McKelvin before. And they looked at that and they're like, that doesn't look anything like him. Yeah. So it's like what you want to believe. If you want to believe that the entire sheriff's department is corrupt and the son did this, you're going to see Richard McKelvin in that composite sketch.
And I wonder how much of that went to Cisco's guilt. They're like, people wanted him to be guilty, so he gave them a story about the sheriff's son. So they're like, okay, well, we want the sheriff's son to be guilty, so that means Cisco had to have done it too. And this story Cisco told is true. So that reinforces the need for Cisco to be guilty.
Well, this episode is called The Man with the Rabbit's Foot, right? And it aired on Investigation Discovery. You can watch it on Investigation Discovery online. And what is coming up on Killer in Question? There's an episode coming up this Sunday, right?
Yeah, you can also download the app for free and watch it on Go. So you can go back and watch the Titus case or the Duckett case and Cisco. And coming up is an episode. This is a little different from other shows. This is more of a family drama. The title of the show is called The Bingo Queen, and a woman is found murdered in her apartment. She's 70-some years old. She's found by her granddaughter. Again, it looks like a burglary gone bad, which is kind of a common theme in all of these shows. And there's no real leads. There's a lot of fingerprints in the apartment, but when they run them through the database, they're not hitting on anyone. The leads they do have all pan out. They chase them to the end. They're not leading anywhere. And so the family is really distressed and they want answers. And so they start turning on each other and pointing the finger at one of their own. So this is a story about, who do you believe, how you interpret evidence. It's really interesting. It's really heartbreaking. It was a very big, close family, and it absolutely tore them apart.
Well, you can watch all of Killer in Question online on the ID app. And this Sunday, November 22nd at 9 Eastern, 8 Central, you can watch the episode of Killer in Question, The Bingo Queen. I'm going to check it out. Tania, I'm going to let you go so that Susan and Jacinda can answer some questions from listeners about the Titus case. Thanks so much for talking to us about the Cisco case.
Oh, you're so very welcome. It's a pleasure.
So, Susan, I want to answer a couple listener questions about the Titus case, but I understand the first one came not from online, but from offline. So what is that question?
Yes, our first question this week is from my mom, who wants to know, are you married to the Kevin that was on the show?
What does she want to know?
If you're married to the Kevin that was on this show, because Kevin Fitzpatrick from Ed Marble was on, and you mentioned Kevin, your husband.
No, I'm not married to that Kevin. My Kevin is a different Irish Kevin named Kevin Flynn.
Kevin Fitzpatrick, Kevin Flynn, I can see the confusion there.
A whole different person. I wonder if she'd like sense some chemistry between me and Kevin.
She just heard you talking about Kevin. She's like, that was the guy in the show, right?
Well, we do have some actual questions about the case. So someone on Twitter, Lever Bertmore, it's always fun to read people's Twitter handles and pretend that those are names, wants to know any more on the 3 unidentified fingerprints from the wallet contents. Were they ever run through APHIS, he says, or compared to Thomas Dillon? #UD Addendum, which, by the way, is how to tag your questions if you have them for us for the addendum. So, guys, what about these fingerprints?
So the annoying thing is there's a lot we don't know. There's no records of where exactly the prints were found, other than possibly on some cards and the one that's on the gun. So that's bothersome. But for at least 3 of the prints that were unidentified and still unidentified, it looks like in 01 they were run through APHIS. And it's possible they would have been matched against Dillon, but that's, again, I can't confirm that. All we know is that they're definitely not Titus or any Titus's friends that they tested, which is like all of them. And they're not Bennett's or people that they could guess might have the prints there. So that's the only real physical evidence in this case that potentially has value. Like, we don't know that it's connected to the crime. That we don't know the killer, someone left it there, but it's a definite possibility. So there is that hope that if we needed, there's no DNA, but we might have this.
Yeah. So Tony Jeff on Facebook has a question about the theory of the case, I guess, that the state has put forth. He says, Titus went hunting 30 minutes away, but sensed, I guess, that someone was on his property and sneaked away. He planned to do something like this for the first time, and on the hunch that people could be there on his property, he took the risky subterfuge of sneaking away when he, 1, had no idea the hunters would actually be there, and 2, hadn't done anything wrong at that point. What a crazy theory, Tony Jeff says.
Correct. That is, in fact, the theory we're going with here.
Yeah, and it's the one thing that has never, ever made sense to me. You know, no one can explain why Titus would have picked up from, 27 miles away. We know he loves to hunt. We know he lives and breathes to hunt. And why would he pick up when he just has a few hours left to hunt and say, I'm going to go see if anyone's on my property, and if they are, I'm going to kill them?
He had a feeling that someone was 200 plus feet from his property, so he just had to go. That's it. That's what we're dealing with here.
Spidey sense.
Yep. So
this is like even nuttier than that ninja sense we heard about.
Yeah, the hunter sense, the ninja sense. Michigan loves these extra sensory perceptions by killers.
Exactly. All right, Susan, what should we expect on next week's episode of Undisclosed?
You should expect Thanksgiving and no episode. But we're back on the 30th.
Okay, 5. So what should we expect on the episode of Undisclosed coming out in 2 weeks?
We're going to get more into the alibi and where Titus was, how far away he was. What is the theory here? What would Titus have to do to be guilty of this crime?
All right. Well, that's an interesting question that is worth pondering, and I can't wait to hear what you guys think about it in the episode of Undisclosed. Jacinda Davis, it was so wonderful talking to you again. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Susan Simpson, it's always a pleasure talking to you about your cases, your theories, all the details you bring to the table. Great talking to you again.
See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks so much for listening to the Undisclosed Addendum. Do you have questions for the next addendum in 2 weeks? You can email them to undisclosedpodcast@gmail.com or send them to us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Audio production for the addendum is by Hannah McCarthy. The executive producer of Undisclosed is Mithil Telhan. You can listen to more of me on my other podcast, Crime Writers On. Follow the show on social media everywhere at Undisclosed Pod. I'm Rebecca Lavoie for everyone at the Undisclosed team. We'll talk to you soon.